So it's a natural place for a philosopher to look at how human beings are living now. We are obsessed by this thing called the news. We hardly even think about how odd it is that we're looking at it all the time. I think it's quite odd, not always helpful, sometimes wonderful, and I wanted to examine it.
What bothers you most about the news?
There's very little thought given as to why you particularly need this information. Why do you need to know that a ship left the coast of Vietnam this morning at 6 o'clock laden with coal? Why do you? Somebody may know this, but the news is telling you. And so a lot of the news that we hear is slightly random, slightly at odds with what we might really care about. There's this idea that the news is always important. We call it the news with a big T, not some news, but the news. And it has almost, it speaks to us like almost from the voice of God. This is what you need to know now. But actually, many of the things we need to know happened 2,000 years ago. Some of them happened in the last 10 minutes, but not everything that is important happened in the last 10 minutes.
You even call the news the new religion, a replacement for religion.
It replaces religion in the sense that it has such authority over our lives, and also that we go to it regularly for guidance, a sense of right and wrong, a sense of what's important. It is the most prestigious force in modern society.
Poetin ondertekent het verdrag dat de Krim tot een Russisch grondgebied maakt.
Onze leerkrachten missen intellectueel niveau.
Engeland kreunt onder de vele regen en felle wind.
De machtigste man van de wereld is een dag in België.
In de Krim heerst een gespannen rust.
Er is onrust in verschillende gevangenissen in ons land.
Euthanasie voor minderjarigen is goedgekeurd.
De bevolking begreep er niets meer van.
I want to show you something, because in your book you write that we are really bombarded with news, that the world is presented as something very fragmented, that we don't understand, there is no context. I'm wondering how you look at this kind of news when you see this.
Saadi Gaddafi, zoon van de vermoorde Libische leider Muammar Gaddafi, is door Niger uitgeleverd aan Libië. Libië zal hem nu berechten voor verduistering en gewapende intimidatie. Een internationale delegatie van vrouwen die via Egypte naar Gaza wilden reizen voor de Internationale Vrouwendag van zaterdag zijn door de Egyptische overheid tegengehouden en worden het land uitgezet. In Venezuela in Zuid-Amerika is de dood van de vorige president Hugo Chavez herdacht 1 jaar geleden.
When you watch these bits of information, do you think your life has become richer by it, or do you think...
Well, I'm just trying to think, what have I just seen? I've already forgotten the third story. What was the third story?
Venezuela.
Venezuela, right? So, in other words, about 20 seconds after having seen it, I have forgotten the third story, and 5 minutes away from this, I'll remember nothing. And most of the audience, if you ask them what happened last week, they just cannot remember. Our brains are different to the way that the newsroom thinks they are. The newsroom thinks you just pour in lots of stuff, it all stays, it's all very important. In fact, we are very different creatures. If somebody says to you, I'm going to tell you something very important, you go, oh, okay, I'll listen. But you listen, but then it just goes away. We are people who are reading about 40 novels all the time. And people just give us a novel, let us read one sentence, and then give us another novel, one sentence, like this. And we don't know what's going on anymore. I mean, it would be much better to watch, 1 hour about Mr. Gaddafi, and then that's it, nothing more. We cannot take in as much information as we're given. We cannot digest it. The news used to be so hard to gather. There used to be very little news. The front page used to be small. Now we have so much news. And it's the same thing as with food. It used to be fine to eat ice cream because there wasn't very much ice cream around. And we didn't know the problems with it because now we can have ice cream every minute of the day and half the population is obese. And we have a similar health problem in the area of news.
So what's the effect on people and how they see the world when they watch this kind of...
So in a way, everything seems important and nothing in particular seems important. There's the Malaysian jet, but then there's also Hugo Chavez, and then there's also this, and then there's also... So in a way, everything is so important that actually nothing is important. So it weirdly makes us non-political. When there are only a few things, you think, oh, I've got to fight for the new park in my neighborhood, or I'm going to try and get the government to do this. When there's too much information, you just don't do anything.
Do people miss out on something when they do not follow the news, when they don't watch the news, when they don't read newspapers? Do they miss something?
Yes, they're in danger of missing something, and they're in danger of missing something when they watch the news too much. Let's remember that the news regularly misses very big stories. For example, the financial crisis, the problems that were brewing in the world's banks in 2005, 2006. All the world's media missed that story. Everybody in the news watches what everybody else in the news is doing. And so that is how societies can fall into mass delusions. It's a problem.
Are you saying that journalists are superficial human beings that do not see the true reality of things?
Not always. Some of them are brilliant, but the industry is guilty of a certain narcissism in constantly looking at what other people are doing. So I've sat in rooms where what are they looking at? They're looking at other news sources. So they're not looking at the world. They're not going out there and looking at reality. They are looking at what other people in the news have found. So you do get errors this way. You get repetitions of errors.
When I became editor-in-chief, I told my journalists, go to the bar more often.
Right.
Then you will pick up more stories about real life, what happens, which is not on the wires, the press agencies.
Yeah.
And they looked at me as if I was coming from Mars.
Yeah, yeah. How interesting. And are you still telling them that?
I'm still telling them that.
Yeah, yeah, of course. That's such a brilliant idea, because I would love a newsroom in which you can take that sort of risk, in which journalists are allowed to go out there, look for a story, hasn't appeared anywhere else, seems important to the journalist, and, we'll wait and see. Too often in the newsrooms of the world, there is such pressure never to get anything wrong, and in that sense, people never get anything properly right either. So you need to give your journalists some freedom to fail, to be individuals, to open their eyes and ears. But that's challenging, especially when budgets are tight.
Sometimes my audience mails me and they say, it's all about misery. It's all about disaster. I get depressed by the news. I don't watch anymore.
Yes, I mean, look, there definitely needs to be a balance. Really what people need is an accurate sense of what the world is like. And because the news focuses always on the disaster, you can get a sense that the whole of the world is a disaster, which it isn't. It stops us, for example, trusting anyone. Because if on the news all you see is murderers, paedophiles, crazy people, if your car breaks down on the side of the road and you have to ask a stranger for help, you will think, my God, I'm going to meet a murderer, because you think everybody is a murderer because you've read the news. But of course, there are not very many murderers around. So because the news focuses on the exception, but because it does this every day, our sense of normality is fundamentally distorted.
In a classic sense, for many of my colleagues, the news is the extraordinary, the disaster, something that happens today and didn't happen yesterday. Is that what we are missing out? That we do not connect these extraordinary facts to the ordinary lives of people that we think that is too ordinary to report on?
I think the category of ordinary and extraordinary is full of, can be debated. In other words, there is something extraordinary about, a child taking its first steps, or the first birds of spring being born. Now, the news doesn't see this as extraordinary, because the news, under the category of extraordinary, it thinks someone has died, a bomb has exploded, etc. So, I'm not against the extraordinary, but let's be careful about what we decide is extraordinary. And certainly the news, because it focuses on a disaster vision of extraordinary, again, it is in danger of missing many, many things. It misses stories because it has a filter, and only certain kinds of information get through the filter.
People have been taught to watch the news as the extraordinary. Because if it is the ordinary, what is normal, they don't watch anymore because it's not a sensation in their lives.
I think it all depends how you do it. This comes down to art. Of course, there is a way of making a very boring film about something ordinary and everyday, and a very exciting film. It all depends how it's done. A great news journalist, a great filmmaker can make something amazing and powerful out of a little thing, and a very bad filmmaker, very bad journalist can massacre a huge story. I think that journalists have an idea of themselves as being providers of data. So they will say, get me the story, the data, how many dead, get me a picture, get me a quote, right? That's what news editors will tell their journalists. Now, really, in order for quotes and pictures and data to become not just true, but important for people, you need to work a bit harder. It needs to be the right picture. The facts need to be connected up with something that the audience can understand, care about, relate to. So too often we have a data-driven vision of the news, when really we should have an artistic vision of the news.
One of the amazing things in your book that you state is that the news doesn't help us to care.
Yes, because caring about people doesn't just mean knowing facts about them. So if I say to you, 100 people died in Mali today, you might go, oh, and then you forget about it 5 seconds later. But if I say, no, there was this girl in Mali, she was 15, she had just left her mother, she was called this, she was on the way to the shops, she was going to be a hairdresser, then she got mowed down by a guy on a motorcycle, etc. Then you begin to care. So we are storytelling creatures. We like details, we like familiarity. And the news deals in abstractions, 100 here, 1,000 there, 10% are miserable, 100% are, we can't relate to these statistics. We can't feel through statistics. And because we can't feel, we end up not caring. And so you end up with that weird situation where populations know lots of facts, but they don't care.
Another thing you state in the book is that news parachutes us into places only when disaster strikes. We also need to know the steady state of a state. I want to show you something, which is quite remarkable. I'm curious about your opinion on that. It's a piece about Goma.
Nu is het een succes, maar het was een lange weg om het festival Amani, Amani betekent vrede in het Swahili, ook echt gerealiseerd te krijgen. Voor het eerst staan hier artiesten uit Congo, Burundi en Rwanda, het land dat hier geregeld binnengevallen is, op hetzelfde podium.
Vous savez, je suis né en 1994, 10 jours après les génocides au Rwanda. Donc longtemps, disons, je vais dire presque toute ma vie, je l'ai passé dans les ténèbres, dans les noirs.
It's very poetic. J'ai passé dans les ténèbres.
Met meer dan 10.000 toeschouwers werd het Amani-festival een echt succes. En de boodschap van de jeugd van Goma klonk door tot ver buiten het festivalterrein.
If we show these stories, do you think they could appeal to people, so to say, that Congo has normal aspects as well, and it's not always war-torn, disaster?
Yes, it's very important to show people daily life. And because if you don't show daily life, you don't understand the disruption, the war, the chaos, etc. You need to show daily life. And it is unbelievable how, despite our satellites and our foreign correspondents and the news machine still does not reliably gather images of other places outside of catastrophes. So if you say to most people, Peru, they go, I don't know. If you say, do you have any picture of Bolivia? Bolivia. I don't know. What is Bolivia? So people don't know, despite this supposed avalanche of information.
Do you think it's a good example to show people such a thing as well?
I mean, I'd want to start with the basics. So I want to start with people's homes. where do people live in Burundi? Say, like what is literally daily life like? So where do they sleep? What's family life like a basic anthropology. What do they eat? What are the jobs like? How do relationships work? How does dating work? How does sex work? How does rearing children work? Like before the music festival, I'd want to know some basic, really basics. The family of man, as it were. We are a global family, but we don't know any of these other people because we are not introduced through the news.
This president is pure fiction.
Why did you call President Obama a retard?
Okay, explain to me why retard is inappropriate.
I'm warning you, America. This is the sign of a dictator.
Oh, look at him. He cares about the children. Screw you.
This guy is, I believe, a racist.
Hurry up and die.
The enemy is not only in the gates, they're inside the house.
Many of my colleagues, many of my journalists, they would stagger when they hear you say that they have to have more bias, that neutrality is wrong.
Yeah.
For most of the journalists, neutrality is something sacred.
Yeah. So this is the idea that if you're a serious news journalist, you must never tell the audience what to think, or you must never put too much of yourself or your feelings or your interpretation, because this will disturb them, because they have their own thoughts. But I think very often, in order to understand a situation, it can really help for a journalist to go, you know, to have somebody who says me or I, a person who we know as a journalist, who will say, I went to the Crimea, you know, and I felt a bit hungry, and I missed my girlfriend, and I was a bit scared at this point, and I think this guy is rather horrible, and I think this one's rather nice, right? So in other words, it guides you, the audience, as to what to think. Now, you may not agree, but it just gives you something to bounce off. Look, imagine you invited somebody for dinner and you said to them, so, how's your job? And they said, well, I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to lay out some information and you decide. And you want to go, really? You can't tell me? You go, and then you go, so what do you think about the economy? And they go, I'm sorry, I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to lay out the facts. By the end of the dinner, you'd want to strangle this person. You'd want to go, just tell me what you think. I don't mind. I won't be influenced by you unless I want to be. So there's this idea that the audience is like a child who will, you know, collapse if they're told something. No, I mean, you can tell an audience something. You can say, I think this is bad and this is good, and the audience will respond. You know, they won't be brainwashed. They will make up their own minds. In fact, it will help them to make up their own minds. It's very hard to make up your own mind when the news is not making up its own mind.
There was a new jail in Belgium, and there was 1 or 2 journalists that could go inside and test out this jail.
Right.
And we filmed this with the personal experience of the journalist, which created a lot of buzz in the newsroom. Can we do this? Is this news? Can she be so personal?
Die eeuwige controle, ook 's nachts, om het uur, het licht aan in de cel, het is verschrikkelijk. Elk uur word je wakker.
Het leven in de gevangenis begint heel vroeg. Parketmagistraten Annemie Serlippes en onderzoeksrechter Karel van Kouwenbergen zijn opnieuw de hulpjes van dienst.
Koffie en een dekentje, denk ik.
Ja, vreselijk, hè?
Oh, verschrikkelijk.
Yeah.
What's your feeling when you
Sure.
see
I mean, you know, these things always work well because we like a personal story. It's always easier to understand something through the eyes of a person than through the eyes of an anonymous, blank viewer. That's just how it is.
Let's say that you, as a philosopher, could take my seat as editor-in-chief of the news. What would your priority be? What would your ultimate goal be?
I think the ultimate goal is I want Belgium to do well. It's in a way a patriotic duty, not patriotic in a kind of silly or chauvinistic way, but I want to help my country to do well, and I want its people to do well. So I want to get the information that will help the country and the individuals within it to go better. And that could be a lot of things. Sometimes it means I have to give them hope. Sometimes it means I have to give them bad news. Sometimes it means I need to explain something very difficult that they're not understanding. But in a way, you are a kind of explainer to the nation. Your job is political in the deepest sense. You want the polis, the community, to go better. So as you lie awake at night, you have to think, what is wrong with Belgium? That has to be the question. What is wrong with Belgium? What are the illnesses of Belgium, both personally and politically? Maybe people are not kind enough. Okay, so if people are not kind enough, let's think about that. How could that be a story? Maybe people are too stressed. Okay, so let's look at stress. What is that? You are, as it were, the head of a government, but the government is not in power. You can only describe what you want to happen. But you do have a kind of government in exile position. And ultimately, the destiny of Belgium is partly in your hands.
So we have a huge responsibility.
An enormous responsibility. Enormous power. Enormous power. There is nothing as powerful as the news. You know, it's not the writers. My book, if it was a big bestseller, it would sell, you know, 50,000 copies, 100,000 copies in Belgium, right? Nothing compared to the audience figure. How many do you get every night?
1.2 million.
Right, 1.2 million. So in other words, there is nothing in your society that regularly gathers 1.2 million Belgians, right? It is an enormous power. And until now, very often that power is not used properly. It could be so amazing. And instead, it spreads, it dissipates, like a whole pile of money that could be used properly is dissipated. So, yeah, it could go a lot better. But it sounds like you're a good man who has good ideas, so I have faith in you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.